Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Maryland Risk Management Education Podcast. My name is Paul Geringer. I'm the Extension Legal Specialist here in the Department of Ag and Resource Economics at the University of Maryland. And today we're steadily getting into 2020. So today I kind of wanted to talk about something I'd recently written and contributed to a local magazine to kind of bring up the topic to make you start thinking about it too as we go through 2020, that maybe this is the year you finally start to develop a written lease for your operation. So, like I said, we're well into 2020, and many of you have already made your New Year's resolutions. So, let's talk about one thing that you really can change, that you might not have included in those resolutions. How about developing a written farm lease? Why do we want to develop a written lease? Well, putting this lease in writing provides landowners and tenants with a written record of the agreement. It can also help settle disputes down the road. I know what you're saying, but Paul, I've always used handshake deals with my agricultural leases. I know that verbal leases have been the norm for most farmers over the years. The landowner and the tenant can often view a verbal lease as showing trust in one another. Although this may convey confidence, a written lease provides a record that two parties have agreed upon, and this can prevent future misunderstandings down the road. We've all been in those relationships where something has been misstated, something, whether it's been business, per- personal, whatever. We've all had that where we've said something and it's been misinterpreted. We may not always understand what the other person has said. The other thing we need to point out is, your memory is not always as good as you think it is. I hate to be the bearer of bad news on that, but your memory is not always as good as you think it is. I deal with that every day, having to accept that my memory is not always as good as I think it is. And this written record can really help you down the road better remember and better understand what you agreed upon. This written lease can formalize what the parties have agreed upon and will provide a record of it. The written record can also clear up many uncertainties that can exist in verbal leases. Let's look at an example. With the verbal leases, the notice to terminate the lease is often dictated by state law. The amount of time required to give notice to terminate can vary state to state. In Maryland, for example, this means that the landlord or tenant who wishes to terminate the lease must provide a 6 months notice to terminate. In a state like Pennsylvania, state law requires 15 days for leases less than 1 year in duration and 30 days for leases greater than 1 year in duration. Think about it. If you live in a state like Pennsylvania with 15 to 30 days to remove equipment, livestock, and other property from the farm, is that enough time? If you live in Maryland, is 6 months enough time? This is something we can do away with in the written lease. We can figure out what amount of time we need to get off the property, put it in the written lease, and deal with it that way. What about crops still growing on the farmland when the lease terminates? The answer is not entirely clear in many jurisdictions. Many states have adopted the idea that allows tenants to go back on to cultivate, harvest, and remove crops before terminating the lease. In many states, this doctrine only applies to annual crops such as corn, wheat, barley, soybeans, but not perennial crops such as apples or other forage crops. So, why do we need a written lease? Well, a written lease would clarify how we can come back on the property to get those crops, what we can do, and when we need to be off the property if it does terminate and we do have crops growing. This is one thing that it just clarifies that tenant's ability to harvest crops after the lease terminates and can resolve. It can also dictate how we're going to put damages on any perennial crops that we may not be able to harvest. We may enter into the lease with the landlord knowing fully well we're going to put in, some type of forage crop that's perennial that, we talk about in the written lease process, develop it that way. And we can kind of develop out how the crop will be paid for if we terminate the lease early. We don't want the landlord to get some kind of windfall, but we do want the landlord to come in with a fully developed written lease so everyone's clear on what happens if the lease terminates. These are just some examples that I've seen with verbal leases over the years. they can be cleared up by merely developing a written lease. You might be asking yourself, hey, how do I get started in this, Paul? What do I need to do? Well, in the show notes, I'm going to put in some example. The Vermont Law School has recently developed a farm lease builder through their Center for Agricultural and Food Systems. That is a really helpful thing that will allow you to customize a lease that you want to develop. It has some predetermined terms in there. You can go into the University of Maryland. We have some as well that will be helpful for you. The one major thing is no matter what you do when developing this, you'll put it together, you'll do it yourself. Don't take it as a final word. Run whatever you do by an attorney. Make sure that what you're doing works. And if they have other suggestions, take a moment, think about them. These are issues they may have seen in their own practices that may come up that you may be able to want to develop into the lease just to make sure that you're not in those situations. As I often point out to people, written leases are kind of everything we've seen in what we've done that goes wrong potentially, and how do we solve it without having an issue come up. So if something's happened in a previous landlord tenant relationship, think about that. How would you solve that issue? How would you want to work with that issue with the current landlord you're dealing with or tenant, and sort of work through that to kind of figure out what you want to do. So again, all the resources, the link to the farm lease builder, the University of Maryland leases um, are in are in the show notes. So thank you again for listening. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me at lgoering@umd.edu, or you can tweet me on Twitter. You can send me a message on Instagram, all at aglawpaul. Thank you again for listening and enjoy the rest of your day.